Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Joining us today on the podcast, I've got Bill Buckley, the columnist for Ducks Unlimited magazine, who writes the Waterfowler's World column, which many of you are very aware of. Bill, welcome to the DU Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And what we've got Bill on a while, Bill does write the column, Waterfowler's World for the magazine every issue. Bill is a professional photographer and has really, he's probably shot images in just about every publication that some of our listeners read and look at, and have probably seen thousands of Bill's images throughout. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you an opportunity, Bill, to kind of share your story, who you are, how you became a professional photographer, writer, where you're from, and just kind of talk about you and give a brief little introduction.
Oh, thanks. I've been doing this for a long time. I've probably been photographing for about 26 or so years. Actually, I kind of got my start with DU, so I'm very grateful for my association with DU. I started off photographing and writing after I lost an editing job in the middle of building my Montana home. And it was a little disconcerting. But at any rate, I had a huge interest in waterfowl always and started picking up the camera. And I started shooting and got connected with Ducks Unlimited, which led to doing a couple books for them, The Waterfowler's World, as well as there are a couple other books, actually, but Misery Loves Company being the main follow-up book. But it got me into photographing regularly for the magazine, and that was really wonderful. So that, in turn, kind of allowed me to then expand my photography business and photograph for a lot of different outdoor publications like Outdoor Life and Field and Stream, and pretty much any magazine that deals with gun dogs, American Hunter magazine, just pretty much almost anything that has been out there, I've photographed for, and it's been a really wonderful life so far.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know, that's one thing that, Ducks Unlimited magazine really, prides itself on is, the imagery throughout the magazine. And I know our photo editor, John Hoffman, takes a lot of pride in selecting those images. And I'm sure our audience has probably seen, like I said, countless images from you over the years. So it's great to have you on here and kind of talk about this. And that's what we're going to talk about in this show is we're going to talk about photographing your hunt. We get a lot of, you can even ask me, like, do you get a lot of photography questions? Like, we don't get a ton of very specific photography questions, but we do get a lot of photography interest, if that makes sense. Our photo contest is one of the most popular features that we do every year. Also, everyone that does the survey following each issue, they always mention, how much they enjoy looking at the images throughout, the waterfowl imagery, the hunting imagery. And it really stands out as something that makes DU magazine what it is. But before we get started in the photography thing, this is something that I do with every guest that I have had on so far during this season is I want to ask you how your waterfowl season was. And I know you're there in Montana and it was a weird year no matter what, but I just want to know exactly, how your waterfowl season went throughout 2020, 2021.
Well, my season was a bit weird because I ended up in June tearing a glute muscle really badly, which ended up leading to all sorts of visits to various doctors and whatever. I finally started healing up at the end of November. So literally, I lost all of my big game season, all of early duck season, and no upland bird hunting available either. I literally couldn't walk. And
oh, man.
So by the time December came around, I just said that enough is enough. I could hobble around, and I got my goose decoys out and shoved them in my truck. And I ended up doing a lot of experimentation, hunting by myself frequently. And then on a couple occasions, hunting with just one friend at a time. And that was actually, it turned out to be one of my best most enjoyable waterfowl seasons. And I mean, I didn't even shoot a duck, so that was a little bit depressing, but I hunted Canada geese exclusively, and I got to experiment, and I spent about 5 minutes each trip. So each trip was, I'd go early in the morning, I would hunt the late morning and afternoon, and then I would hunt the next morning, and then I would come back. and I had 6 of those trips, and I had phenomenal hunting with no more than 5 minutes of scouting on each trip. I just say that's not a good example for people, but I experimented with decoys, especially with hiding techniques. I did not take one picture, I hate to tell you. And I had a really successful season, and I always got geese, and then I've been experimenting a lot with cooking geese in different ways than I have in the past. So it was actually a really great end to a season that was fairly depressing starting off.
Yeah, sometimes that's the way it works, is you go into it with either no expectation, or maybe you're even expecting it to be worse than hunts you've had in the past, and it ends up being something that's much more enjoyable, and you realize, hey, this is not too bad.
Yeah. Well, I'd gotten on a kick the previous year. I was so tired in late season of driving around with my buddies trying to find fields that were accessible or available. And it just got tougher and tougher. And then a lot of the geese there would be sitting out in the middle of plowed fields and with nothing but dirt. And so, everyone would say, well, you can't hunt them out there. The geese are too wise right now. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to find a way. And stubble fields are always tough to hunt in if you have low, like wheat stubble, and dirt fields have always been tough. And I ended up coming up with ways where I could hide in either one of those things and have geese fly directly over me at low, altitudes and never see me. It was wonderful. So it was a neat season.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you mentioned that you weren't out there taking pictures, which is, that'll kind of lead us. That's a good transition into, one of the first, and we're kind of basing this conversation off of a very popular column that you did, I think a couple years ago or last year. It's one of those deals where you're just explaining, the different ways, a few small tips to shoot better photography when you're waterfowl hunting. And like I said, it kind of transitions into, since you didn't even use your camera, but the first one that you mentioned, is be ready to shoot. And kind of explain, how you were, kind of started off with this particular tip.
Okay. Well, I remember, I used to travel around a lot to, let's say, Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas, and I would oftentimes hunt and then photograph. And I would always find when I had a gun, all the best opportunities for photography would seemingly pass me by. And so I ended up, deciding at one point that I had to have my camera ready at all times. And so, I mean, for a professional, it's a little bit different. Most of the time now I go and I photograph exclusively. I don't hunt. But for most hunters, I would say this, that, you wouldn't start calling ducks when you don't have your gun loaded. At least I hope you wouldn't. And unless you weren't planning to shoot. Similarly, you end up passing up so many good opportunities because your camera's still in your blind bag and it still has the lens cap on and it's not turned on. And so what I do actually the night before a photo shoot or a hunt is I will actually take my camera out and I will take the settings on the camera I will set it up for basically low light situations because, as you know, down in Arkansas, Tennessee, your shooting hour starts a lot earlier than I can photograph, but I still want to make sure that as soon as there's enough light to photograph, I'm going to be able to. So I set my camera at the lowest shutter speed that I think I can get away with handheld, which is typically, well, depending on the lens you use, but typically about 250th of a second is pretty safe. And then I take my ISO setting and I put it up really high, whatever my camera can handle. So I have cameras that are capable of shooting with post-production, halfway decent pictures at 4,000 ISO. For most people who don't have professional cameras, it's probably more about 1,000 or 1,250, somewhere around in there. But basically set up your camera for low light, because that's going to be the first light you have in the morning. And then, when it's not, it's still too dark to photograph and you can still hunt, go ahead and hunt, but at least you have your camera ready for when an opportunity for a good picture presents itself.
Yeah, no, and being ready. And from my experience, I'm by no means a professional photographer, but I do shoot a lot of images. And in my experience, I have tried to do both multiple times, thousands of times. And what I've learned is when I'm trying to do both, shoot images and shoot ducks, I'm bad at both. And I've had to, either choose one or the other if I'm really trying to get an image or I'm really trying to, focus on the hunt. I kind of choose one. I guess that'd be my recommendation. You have to choose one over the other, but at least have your camera ready. So, and just to go back a little bit, you mentioned, having like a large aperture, high ISO. Exactly. Can you explain just briefly, like, what is aperture and what is ISO?
Yeah, so ISO is basically like your film speed. So the higher the film speed or the higher the ISO, the faster you can shoot, the more light, or the less light you can shoot in, I should say. So you can shoot in dimmer situations than you could with a lower ISO. So let's say most color film used to be 200 or 400 ISO. With digital cameras now, you can pump that up to 1,000 plus ISO, and that allows you to shoot in a lot lower light. Similarly, every lens has different apertures, and what they will say a maximum aperture is its widest, meaning the most open, which allows the most light in. So it's typically the smallest number that's available to you. So it might be something in terms of an 2.8 f-stop or a f4 versus a smaller aperture, which is like f16, which is like a pinprick. It allows you have to have a lot of light, but it gives you a greater depth of focus, what we call a depth of field. So when a lens is wide open, it tends to have less in focus than from forward and backward than a lens that is cranked down to, let's say, f11 or f16, which will allow a lot more in focus. But having it wider open means you can shoot in lower light as well. So exposure is a function of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And so what you want to do for the lowest light settings is to favor all those things. So you tend to shoot with a little bit lower shutter speed than maybe you'd like to have when the light gets better. You have a more wide open aperture, and then you have a higher ISO. And
then you're adjusting that as the, sun rises and the marsh brightens up or whatever. So yeah, I just wanted to stress that.
Oh yeah. So what I'll do is I will typically start working. So as it gets lighter, I'll start increasing my shutter speed, because the shutter speed shutter speed helps you. The higher the shutter speed, the more action you can stop, and also the more handshake you can overcome. And so I want to make sure I get that up to wherever it happens to be. If there's not much action going on and dogs aren't jumping and retrieving, racing to retrieve birds, and people aren't shooting, I may not be worried about having a fast shutter speed. But, if there is action, I'm wanting to get my shutter speed up to at least 500th of a second and more preferably up to 1,000th of a second. And then after that, as it still continues to get lighter, I'm going to lower my ISO, or my film speed. And why is because the higher the ISO, the more grainy your pictures will be. So I want to get the quality of the image less grain down. And so I will start lowering my aperture to something that I know will give me like really good pictures without having to worry. So I'll typically bring it down in field conditions to 400 ISO. And then after that, if I want, and if I don't want to have a shallow depth of focus, then I will go and I will start increasing my aperture to get more things in focus. And it depends on what you're trying to photograph. If you're trying to photograph a person or a dog, you might want to have the background be all blurry because that really makes the subject stand out. But if you're photographing action photography where you're wanting to get birds and hunters shooting at them or calling to them, all in focus, then you're going to have to increase your aperture and get more depth of field. So it's just a balancing act. So the more light you have, the more options are available to you creatively.
Yeah, that's great. And, that really kind of leads us into the next tip here that, once you're ready to shoot and you've got your settings where you want them, as you're shooting throughout the morning, you mentioned here that you want to check your images. I mean, that's the convenience of digital photography, really. And I'm sure you can speak
yes.
to that, probably better than most of, pre-digital. But,
yes.
Frequently checking the camera's display panel to see if you're getting what you want.
Oh, it's huge. It's such a huge, that was the ultimate game changer. Well, two things. I remember when I was shooting film, you could only shoot up to 36 frames then you'd have to change your film. And if you're around water, you had to worry about opening up your camera and then fumbling around with frozen hands and not dropping that roll into the water, which would ruin it. And then putting another roll in. But but the other thing is being able to tell what you're actually doing. And so, I tell people all the time, the biggest advantage, I think it's called chimping. And you look down at your camera all the time and zoom in and see whether or not something's in focus, because ultimately you can get away with a lot of inexact photo technique with, if you don't have something too terribly overexposed or underexposed or whatever, but you cannot overcome an out of focus picture. And so this allows you to see what's happening. You can also see whether, gosh, you know what, I'm not really low enough. I don't have a low enough perspective. Or let's say your buddies are out there putting up decoys and it's this beautiful orange sunrise starting to happen behind them. And you take a picture and you notice that their heads get lost in the dark tree line behind them or the marsh line. And just by lowering yourself, you can have their heads sticking above all that and they're distinct again, and it becomes a good picture. So the ability to look at what you're doing and see what maybe you're doing right or wrong and then fix it in camera is just wonderful. So it's a huge advantage. So take advantage. So use it to the full extent.
Yeah. And that's a good lesson for everyone, because I know I've personally shot, 8 or 10 or 50 frames early morning and then look down at them and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're pitch black. I had something not right. And so I made that adjustment, as quickly as I could and tried to salvage, that still, that good light that you're really looking for, that early morning. It's kind of, what everyone seems to really early morning, sunrise or sunset late. You're really trying to capture those visuals that are so, prevalent in waterfowling that you really, having the right settings and being able to know what you're doing is the way to do it.
That's right.
The next thing that you talked about in the column is follow the sun. And I know I've talked to several photographers over the years, and it's just lighting. That's the key, but kind of explain what you were talking about as far as follow the sun.
Yeah. So one of the great things about digital and also being able to see what your camera is actually doing by looking at the monitor after taking a picture is the fact that you can take advantage of all sorts of light that literally we couldn't while we were shooting film because we didn't have enough film speed to be able to accomplish it. But my favorite times of photographing are before the sun actually peaks over the horizon and becomes direct sunlight, and right after it sets. And then I'm going to photograph into the sunset or the sunrise. And why I do that is because I'm not looking for silhouettes exactly, but what I want to do is take advantage of that beautiful colored light and I can still see detail in the shadowed side of my subject. And it becomes a lot more dramatic. You get a lot of beautiful rim light. But as the sun comes up and it becomes direct, sometimes you can have the subject in the subject block the sun, and you can still get some really dramatic shots of, but typically as the sun gets higher, it becomes harsher and stronger. And so what you have to do then is say, okay, I can no longer shoot into the sun because I'm just getting a really ugly picture where there's no detail in the shadow. So I'm going to move around, and when the sun is not too strong, I can shoot side lit pictures. And so that can be very dramatic, having one side rim lighted and the other not, but it can be beautiful sunlight. But as it gets a little bit strong, as the light gets a little bit stronger, I'm going to make sure that the sun is to my back. And one of the things that I think hunters are really guilty of is they don't take their camera out until after the hunt is over. And then, they do their hero shots, and it's always under really harsh sunlight. The sun's usually, it's usually 11 o'clock or so in the morning, or 10 if it's been a good hunt, and you're shooting with sun way overhead. Well, even though the sun appears to be straight overhead, it's not. I mean, it's always to one side, and the amount of, as long as you position yourself so that the sun is even slightly to your back, you're going to get infinitely better shots because you're going to have less of people's faces falling into the shadows of their hats, for instance. And you're going to get just a little bit more detail, a lot less contrast. And contrast can be good at times, but contrast from hard sunlight is almost never good for a pleasing picture. So I say follow the sunlight and be deliberate about how you're using it. So if you're, like I say, if I'm shooting before it crests over a horizon in the morning or after it dips down, I'm going to use the sunlight to my advantage and get really beautiful, dramatic shots shooting into them. Because if I have the sun to my back at that point, there's really no direct light, and it becomes a really flat lighted image. And I don't want flat. I want dramatic. So, but always be, I guess, every time, you're deliberate with a shotgun. Every time you pick up a shotgun or you shoulder it, you're going to be very deliberate. You know what you're going to do. You're already thinking ahead about making that shot. The same should be really the way you approach taking a picture, because if you're not thinking about everything, a good pictures don't come from just sort of shooting willy-nilly. I mean, you can luck out and get some interesting pictures, but mainly they come from deliberation and knowing where that sun is and keeping key things in mind. So follow the sun is really, really important.
Yeah. And, and that really, that's also kind of one of your next tips that, you talked about. And this is something that I notice a lot, even looking at people's photographs on Instagram, but, someone's standing in one spot, you can tell they've taken 25 pictures in one spot, but you mentioned don't just stand there, stay on the move, try and get different angles. But what are some of the ways that you approach that when you're, really trying to shoot some really dramatic stuff during a hunt?
Yeah. Well, first off, the biggest consideration for me, I never want to have people say, and it's happened before because you just never know if you're well hidden or not. But I never want hunters to say, it would have been a great hunt if that darn photographer hadn't been out doing everything. And there are times when I want to move and the action is slow. And it's just like, the old joke about having to relieve yourself, as soon as you put your gun down and go somewhere, that's when the few ducks of the morning fly in. It has happened with me in photography. So there's no getting around that. But the main thing is to not interrupt the hunt. And there are certain environments that are so much easier to photograph hunting than others because you are necessarily able to move around a lot and still be hidden. So like for so many reasons, my favorite place to hunt or to photograph hunting is by far flooded timber. Flooded timber is so dramatic. You have trees where you can move around to different trees and hide and shoot. But the main thing is never, there are two things. Never take a picture so where it just looks like you are standing there and taking a picture from eye level. so it becomes really boring really quickly. One of the things about duck hunting is that the action's coming from up in the skies, right? So people are looking up, dogs are looking up. So one of my favorite techniques is to get down low. I can try to shoot as low as my waders will allow. And oftentimes I feel that water creeping into my chest and down my belly because I've gone in too far or have a sleeve full of water. But low angle shots are more dramatic. They're tying the hunter or the dog in with what's coming from up above. You don't necessarily have to have flying ducks in the picture. It's awesome if you do, but that's where the action's coming from. That's where their attention is. So try to tie that in. And yes, move around as much as possible. I guess something that I like to say is that every picture should ideally tell a story. So, and I see a lot of Instagram pictures, and unfortunately Instagram's algorithm encourages people just to post pictures for the sake of posting pictures, but that doesn't show quality. And so, but a good picture tells a story. And so by moving around, for instance, you can get a picture of a lab that's really looking hard, but you might be able to get a guy calling in the background, like right over the dog, or right beside him, or a guy getting ready to shoot, or someone shooting. That ties that dog in the relationship with the dog and the hunter more, or having a hunter calling and having other guys in the background waiting, or conversely, something in front like decoys out of focus, and then seeing a blind or a person hunkered down calling or shooting or whatever, or holding up a bird. Always think about what's in your background and foreground as a means of maybe giving the viewer a little bit more information about what it was like to be there, and trying to think about relationships between things. And so that all means that you have to move around a lot, but ultimately you have to move around to be respectful of hunters and really try not to hunt. The worst places I find to get good pictures in terms of variety is field hunting and in blinds. You put especially if you don't have much cover, like in a stubble field, it's awfully hard to photograph. And if you have a lot of action, then to get out, move around, and then set up again for a different shot. So a lot of times my pictures will look a lot the same if I'm trying to get action photos. I mean, honestly, the best thing that can happen is that the hunting is not insanely good, but you have moments of greatness, and you have periods in between where you are more free. You can see in a long distance whether birds are coming, and then you can get up and you can get close, photograph the rows of hunters. And that works very well. But yeah, so every situation is different, but don't stay in one position. It's just boring.
You got into really the next one, which was improving your composition, which you've really, talked about building the story with your images. But let's take it back to like photography 101. And I just want to allow you to explain the rule of thirds and what that means.
Okay. Well, yeah. So probably the most amateurs' biggest sin is putting the subject right in the middle of the frame. And for photographing people, for instance, on a hero shot, they'll typically have the people's heads right in the middle of the frame and a ton of sky, and they've left out a lot of the environment and the ground and the more interesting stuff. A blue sky is not interesting to look at. I'm sorry, unless you have a sky fetish, it's not interesting. So the rule of thirds is a very basic thing. It's a rule that as you get better you can break, but it is a rule that I use almost with every shot I take, unless there's a reason not to. And that is that you want the subject, whether it's, let's say if you're doing a tight shot of a person, it'll be his face typically, or the whole person, or the whole dog, or a face of a dog, wherever you want the viewer to look at. It's more pleasing to go a third of the way in, both horizontally and vertically. Now, you might want to be having that face on the top third of the frame or the bottom third of the frame, just depending on how much information and other things you want to include in your picture. But it's always more pleasing. I mean, there are times when I will photograph directly, have the subject directly in the middle of the frame, but it's only because of what's happening around. So I'm always trying to see what to include. So I guess the framing, so the rule of thirds is whether you're shooting a vertical or you're shooting a horizontal. You can have a face of somebody, let's say, and for a vertical in the top 1/3. It doesn't have to be 1/3 over. It can be dead in the middle of the frame, left to right, but 1/3 of the way up. And that is a rule of thirds. So it doesn't always have to be work on a horizontal and vertical line, but it typically will give you very pleasing results. I do shoot a lot because of being, making a living off this and having been an editorial photographer for so long. I shoot a lot also with layouts in mind, so magazine layouts. So I might shoot something for a 2-page spread where I have the subject a quarter of the way in, which would put that subject dead middle of one of those pages. So in covers, they depending on the magazine, like a Ducks Unlimited cover, you actually do want that subject a little bit more towards center from a vertical standpoint to allow for the Ducks Unlimited logo. So it's all learning about that. But if you're just doing it for yourself, then the rule of thirds is a really, really good way of doing it. I was photographing turkeys around my house yesterday, and I would guarantee you 99% of the pictures are taken with the rule of third in mind, unless I just didn't frame it very well.
Yeah. One particular image that I see all the time, and I have buddies who love it. And it's just not my speed. It's not something that I go, they're always like, hey, do you want a shot of this? I'm like, nah, I'm good. But like the tailgate shot with the ducks, and that's one that I'm always like, let's not do that. But some people really prefer that. They like to do it, and that's their prerogative. But you talk about in your column, perfecting the hero shot, the end of the hunt, or maybe even during the hunt, but really perfecting that shot to capture, the whole picture of what that hunt was about. Can you kind of explain that and how you recommend to people to really focus on the hero shot?
Yeah, the hero shots can be really pleasing. Again, typically it's late in the morning, and if there's no overcast, then it's going to be a contrasty picture. Again, if you keep that sun slightly to your back, it's going to make it better. But the main thing is actually a good hero shot is really kind of orchestrated right off the bat as soon as you start pulling the trigger. And it's because you want to keep the ducks or geese clean, and so you don't put them in the mud. You lay them out, you smooth down the feathers, you take broken wings and you fold them up to where they look more natural, and take any mud or whatever, or just wipe it off, but keep them clean and dry. And that's going to right away make pictures better. And then instead of having a pile or whatever, if you have a duck strap, that's a wonderful way to do it. Typically, I like to, even though honestly, if it makes more sense to put birds in, hang them by their neck, but you can hang them by their feet, and that will keep their necks looking pretty and their plumage looking pretty, and they'll be more fluffed out that way. But basically, it's how you sort of treat the bird. Take some time to kind of lay them out and smooth them over and get them looking their best, and hiding bloody sides, let's say, of a bird. Or a broken wing side, you can hide that a little bit, but clean them up and sort of kind of be respectful to the bird, and show the colors and show the variety of the birds. But again, nothing is worse than a bedraggled, wet, sort of pressed feathers in the wrong direction against the grain. The birds never look good. And trust me, nobody wants to see those pictures. But, seeing pictures of beautiful birds, that's a little different story, and that will really help. And I guess the last thing is, if you got a limit of birds, show that you're happy about it. you don't have to look glum. I can't stand it. I mean, I'll tell you, fishermen are so much easier to photograph because they're always happy about catching fish, whereas hunters seem to think that they're supposed to, to look serious or something. So really show the fact that you really had a great hunt and smile. So that would be my last tip
No, that's
for the hero shot.
Smile a little bit more. That can be a tip for everything. Just smile more.
Yeah, and badger the hunters in the picture too. I mean, I listen. As they always, male bonding is always, half of male bonding or 90% of it really is teasing the other person, and so tease your hunting buddies. Make them smile one way or the other. But it'll make for a lot better picture later on.
Very cool. And then this has been, really enlightening, even for myself, to learn some of these tips that you're talking about. And really, photography has become so popular, and, the ease of use with, the mobile phone. People, 20 years ago who carried a camera around with them all the time. Well, probably just the professionals. Now, everybody's got a, pretty high resolution camera in their pocket. And just from your perspective, I mean, one, how has that kind of changed things? But two, do you have any recommendations for people who don't have a big, professional camera and who are just pulling out their iPhone and taking a shot? Is there anything that they can do to, really improve?
Yes. Oh gosh. I mean, they're phenomenal because cell phones have these tiny sensors. Basically, when the shutter opens up, that's what sort of records the image. The ability to record contrast is a lot lower, and so that's why you can take pictures in really tricky lighting situations where if I did it with my professional camera, I'd have to really think it through, maybe add some fill light, whatever, and a cell phone takes this beautiful picture and it ticks me off. But yeah, you can, especially some of the cameras today, or the phones today, have cameras that have amazing resolution. But yeah, I would say a couple things. Number one, make sure you make sure you have some sort of a rubberized coating around your phone so it doesn't slip in the water. And there are some waterproof little housings that I would strongly recommend, because one slip and your phone is toast. But again, it's doing the same thing as far as working angles. But one thing you'll notice about cell phones is it's all automatic exposure. Okay, so unlike what I photograph 95% of the time in manual exposure mode, because I can control the light no matter what angle I get in. And these cameras will take a scene that's very bright and it'll say, oh, that should be medium toned, and it'll underexpose the picture. Conversely, if something's really dark, it'll say, no, that's supposed to not be black. It's supposed to be gray. And then it'll overexpose it. So what that does is if you're photographing your buddies putting out decoys, let's say, and most of the sky is lightening up, but the water is still pretty dark other than reflections, it's going to overexpose that picture and it's not going to be very pretty. I'm sorry, it's going to underexpose it because of all the light coming in from the sky. So you'll end up getting a really dark picture, but you can find if you raise the phone up a little bit, maybe tilt it down so that more of the water or the land comes in, that it'll end up raising the exposure to where you see detail of your buddies, and putting out decoys or whatever. So with a cell phone, going up or down to accommodate for that automatic exposure, tilting it slightly or raising it over your head, or conversely getting down low and tilting it up, you can see on your phone when it gets an exposure you actually want and when you can record those beautiful sunsets. And so you'll see a lot of beautiful sunset or what would have been beautiful sunset pictures that are overexposed and it's all the colors washed out. So the way to correct that is to tilt your phone or shoot from a slightly different angle and include a little bit more of either a darker or lighter part of the scene. And I guess the other thing too would be get close. That's one of the things, cell phones are wide angle. And so whenever I'm shooting wide angle, 95% of the time, I'm going to be really tight. I mean, I'm going to worry about distortion and everything, but I'm going to be really tight on the subject because that's interesting. If you pull back on, a scenic on a cell phone is not very, very exciting, but in a scenic with a little person in it's not very exciting. But you get up real close to that person and you can see the detail in the clothing, you see the expression on their face. That makes for a really good picture. So yeah, cell phones are wonderful. I gotta say, when I go on a vacation, I don't take my cameras. I take my cell phone and I take all these shots, and it's fun. But you will find that getting tighter to your subject is going to render a more interesting photograph.
Oh, very cool. And I know that's that's going to be helpful for everybody out there who's not lugging around $10,000 worth of equipment as far as professional photographers.
Sure.
And that's what it's all about. I mean, that's why I wanted to bring you on the show here to some of the things people can do with the equipment, some of the things people can do without, and some of just the basic stuff like the rule of thirds and, understanding ISO and aperture and stuff like that. And that'll improve the ability of waterfowl hunters to share their story with maybe those who are not necessarily waterfowl hunters, but, really provide those stunning images. And I think that's an awesome part of what we're doing.
Yeah, I guess the one last really big tip that I would have, Chris, is that, it all comes sort of that whole thing we talked about where don't just stay in one position and move around. So many pictures are ruined, and I see this with professional photographers too. Where they have a person standing there or a dog or whatever, and there's a tree limb coming out the side of its head or a tree trunk directly behind it that looks like it's coming right up out of their head, or a branch or a blade of marsh grass is cutting across the face of the dog or the eyes of the person. And those are what I call distracting elements, and they ruin pictures. Now, I can fix a lot of that in post-production, but I'd rather not. And for most people who don't even know how to use Photoshop, they can't. They don't have that luxury. So always be aware of what's immediately behind or immediately in front of your subject. And don't just say, I'm sure it'll be okay. There's nothing more depressing than having a sunlit blade of grass cutting across the face of a dog or a person, and that you just flat out either didn't see or just thought, I'm just too lazy today to get up and move. And it ruins, and it'll ruin the picture. Believe me, I've tried to be lazy about it, and there's no point in it. It ruins a picture every time. So that, I guess, would be a big thing too, is always be aware of what's directly behind or in front of what you're taking a picture of the subject, because that will potentially distract from your subject and ruin the picture.
Awesome. No, this has been great, Bill, and I appreciate you joining me today. And we're going to go ahead and figure out a way to get you back on the schedule to come and join us again, and we'll get even further into this photography conversation, because I think our listeners are really going to enjoy this, and I really appreciate you joining me today.
Oh gosh, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun, and hope some of these tips help.
I'd like to thank my guest, Bill Buckley, the columnist for Ducks Unlimited magazine, who writes Waterfowler's World and is a professional photographer. I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for putting the podcast together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.